If HDR is better, why does it sometimes look dimmer or less saturated than SDR video? Hi, I'm Sam, a display tester from RTINGS.com. In this video, we'll break down what SDR and HDR actually are, why HDR can look incredible, and why it sometimes doesn't. We'll also explain a few terms you'll see in our reviews, like color space, PQ EOTF tracking, so you don't feel lost when you're researching a TV. By the end of this video, you'll know when HDR is worth using, when SDR can look more accurate, and what to check if HDR looks off on your setup. Before we get into it, be sure to subscribe to support independent, unsponsored product testing. Let's start with what these two formats are trying to do. SDR, or Standard Dynamic Range, is the traditional video standard. It's what TV and film has been built around for decades, and a lot of content is still mastered specifically for SDR. SDR is designed around a relatively modest reference level compared to HDR. It uses a more traditional brightness curve that sets white as your peak luminance and black as your lowest luminance. HDR, or High Dynamic Range, is designed to show a wider range between the darkest and the brightest parts of the image. The point of HDR is not to make everything brighter. For the most part, it doesn't. It's that the TV has more room to show bright highlights above normal white and deep shadows at the same time, with more nuance and detail, and usually with richer color at higher brightness. HDR is more demanding than SDR. It asks more from the TV and from the quality of the master and the stream. A lot of people think of SDR as the inferior format, but SDR has a big advantage. It's a target that most TVs can hit consistently. SDR is graded around a reference level, commonly around 100 nits for home usage and only about 48 nits for most movie theaters. It's designed to be flexible. In practice, you set your TV's light output to match your room, and SDR scales up and down cleanly while keeping the same overall balance between shadows, midtones, and highlights. So how does SDR differ from HDR? In SDR, brightness is mostly relative. The content is graded around a reference white level, and everything in the image is basically a ratio relative to that white. So if a bright object is meant to be, say, 80% as bright as white, it generally stays around that same relationship whether you watch SDR at 100 nits or 300 nits. You're scaling the whole picture up or down, but the relationship inside the image stays consistent. HDR, using the PQ EOTF curve, is different. PQ, which is short for perceptual quantizer, is designed so that specific signal levels correspond to specific real-world brightness values. In other words, the content can be graded so that a highlight is meant to be at 300 nits, 1000 nits, or even higher. If your TV can't reach that level, it'll tone that. That means the brightest highlights get squeezed closer together so you don't get the full separation the creator graded for. The next term is EOTF, which stands for Electro-Optical Transfer Function. That's just the mapping from the digital signal to real light output of the TV. It's the opposite of what a camera does, which is an OETF, or Optical Electro Transfer Function, which converts light into a digital signal. If PQ EOTF tracking is good, HDR looks closer to how the creator intended. Bright areas look bright, midtones look correct, and shadows don't get strangely lifted or crushed. If PQ EOTF tracking is poor, HDR can look off. Sometimes it looks too dark in midtones, sometimes blacks look raised, and sometimes the TV makes part of the image brighter than the creator intended. That's one of the main reasons HDR isn't automatically better. HDR can be a bigger canvas, but the TV needs to follow the curve well for it to look right, and the creator needs to be using that bigger canvas. SDR also usually uses a narrower color space called Rec. 709. Again, narrower sounds worse, but it's also easier to reproduce correctly. SDR color can look very natural because it's a long-established standard and TVs have been tuned around it for years. So SDR isn't bad. It's just a smaller canvas that most TVs can paint correctly. Now let's talk about why HDR can look better. First, HDR masters can have highlights graded up to 1000 nits, sometimes 4000 nits, or even 10,000 nits. But most HDR images still live in the lower part of the curve, often around the 0 to 200 nit range for a lot of the picture. The point is to keep dark scenes dark and preserve highlight detail, not to make the entire image bright. So if you're used to watching SDR with your TV cranked all the way up to something like 400 or 500 nits in a bright room, HDR can feel dim at first because the TV is trying to keep the midtones where they belong on the PQ curve, while saving the extra brightness for highlights. That's why HDR can look more restrained in the midtones even when the TV has a ton of peak brightness. And yes, you can often choose a brighter HDR picture mode or use a more aggressive tone mapping option to lift the whole image, but it's not as simple as just raising the backlight like you would in SDR. When you lift HDR too much, you can start changing the intended look of the scene, not just the overall light output. HDR content is also often delivered in a wider color container than SDR, like BT 2020, but most HDR movies and shows are graded within something closer to DCI-P3. The important idea is color volume. In HDR, a capable TV can keep colors looking richly saturated even when parts of the image get very bright. That's what makes HDR feel more lifelike, instead of just more colorful. If a TV is too dim in HDR, you can lose that benefit. You might still get the HDR signal, but the volume part of color volume is limited, so HDR can look less impressive. So, when does HDR look better than SDR? First, when you're watching good HDR content. When a movie or show is well graded in HDR, the format can look deeper and more natural. You get more highlight detail, richer contrast, and better color volume. Second, your TV can display HDR well. You don't need the most expensive TV on the planet, but you generally want a TV that can reach strong peak brightness for highlights and can deliver very strong black levels for contrast. This is why OLEDs and good mini LED TVs can both deliver great HDR. Third, you're watching in a controlled lighting environment. HDR benefits from being able to see the darker parts of the image properly, and in a bright room, your eyes adapt to the room and darker elements are harder to perceive. HDR can still look good in a bright room, but the depth advantage is more obvious when you aren't fighting ambient light. And then there's gaming, which is a whole other can of worms and could benefit from its own video. If you want to hear more about that, let us know in the comments down below. This is the part people don't always expect. There are real cases where SDR simply looks better. If your TV can't hit HDR's highs or lows, it has to squeeze that big range into a smaller one. That's when HDR can start to look flat, with highlight detail or shadow detail getting clipped. Switching to SDR often looks cleaner and more balanced because it's built for a smaller range that the whole image scales up together. Also, sometimes the TV's HDR tracking isn't great. If HDR looks like blacks are lifted or the image looks wrong in the midtones, that's often a sign of poor PQ EOTF tracking or heavy-handed HDR processing. In that situation, SDR may look more accurate because the TV can map SDR more reliably. Plus, at times, the stream or master quality isn't great. Not all HDR is created equal. Some HDR streams are just heavily compressed. Some HDR masters are just not that good. HDR can make issues like gradient banding or messy compression more noticeable. If the HDR version looks noisy, blotchy, or unstable in the gradients, the SDR version can sometimes look cleaner. And of course, sometimes the content was just meant to be in SDR. A lot of older movies and shows were graded specifically for SDR. In those cases, SDR isn't a compromise version, it's the intended version. If accuracy is your goal, using SDR for SDR mastered content will be the most faithful choice. So how should you think about HDR versus SDR without overcomplicating it? HDR is an absolute standard. It targets specific real-world brightness values. SDR is a relative standard that fits everything relative to your brightness setting. So what are some quick practical things you can try if your HDR isn't looking so hot? If HDR isn't impressing you, a few simple tweaks can often help. Using a cinema or filmmaker style HDR mode instead of vivid usually improves the accuracy. Trying a more accurate tone mapping option can also help preserve the intended look of the movies. If you're finding it too dim, then using one of the less accurate modes can help make the image look brighter. So, is HDR better than SDR? HDR is better in theory because it gives creators and displays a bigger canvas. You can get brighter highlight detail, more contrast depth, and more color volume than SDR can deliver. But in practice, HDR is only better when the TV can follow the PQ curve well and the content is graded and delivered cleanly. If the TV has weak HDR capabilities, if its tracking is off, if the HDR stream is messy, SDR can look better. The simplest rule is this: HDR is a performance format. When the TV and the content can cash that check, HDR looks better. When they can't, SDR tends to look better. And there's nothing wrong with choosing the version that looks best on your setup. So, what do you mostly watch? Are you a physical media purist with a large HDR library, or an over-the-air SDR cable lover? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you have any questions, our staff and community are on Discord too. Come check it out. Until next time, I'm Sam from RTINGS.com, where we help you find the best settings for your needs.